Well, thank you very much, Sean, and it's lovely to be here in this gorgeous part of Ireland. And can I say hello to anybody watching in Australia, Dubai, or elsewhere? I'm delighted that you are. When I was listening to Carl there in his very optimistic way, saying, things aren't so bad, and the fundamentals are good. I remember, when the bubble was bursting and the economy was crashing. It happened kind of a mantra, a chorus of soft landings and the fundamentals are sound. So whilst not wishing to start on a pessimistic note, I'm going to just give you the health warning that my contribution will be rather more sanguine than the previous speaker. So last week, the government, in its characteristically modest way, gave itself a 94% success rate on delivery of measures in the second quarter of its action plan on jobs. And yet, as the guide to this discussion this evening tells you, all of the key economic indicators at this point are very negative. Let's just look at one. In June of 2011, unemployment was at 14.4%. In June 2012, we have an unemployment rate of 14.9%. A marginal increase, you might say, but an increase nonetheless. Since the start of this year alone, 740 businesses have gone into insolvency, an astonishing 155 in the month of May alone. So it seems to me that the action plan on jobs that we've been promised seems to be an exercise in ticking boxes rather than actually producing jobs. And to be fair to the government, they've acknowledged this, because in the same week as giving themselves an old pat on the back for achieving their own targets, they unveiled a stimulus plan, a multi-annual stimulus plan to the tune of some €2.25 billion. Now, when we in Sinn Féin back in 2008 started arguing for stimulus, we were told that it wasn't needed. We were subsequently told that it wouldn't work. And after that, we were told that that's all very well, but there's actually no money for the stimulus package. So I suppose last week's announcement is probably best described as stimulus for slow learners. Because while the premise of economic stimulus is now accepted, and I'm very gratified by that, the scale of the stimulus we require appears to be sorely misunderstood. And indeed, the broad contours of other government policies run against the grain of stimulating the economy. And so we have a really bizarre situation where a government that has, for instance, axed capital spending is claiming kudos for introducing a stimulus package. Now, we have a deficit problem, and it has to be addressed. There are a range of taxation and savings measures that can be used to do this, and we and I differ radically with government as to what those measures should be. But we all agree that the end game is deficit reduction. But alongside this, we have always pointed out the need for growth and how a stimulus package could kickstart this very growth. And in fact, this has been the overriding theme of all of our publications for the last number of years, and indeed it will be again when we launch a jobs recovery document in September and our pre-budget submission later in the year. The state has the capacity to introduce a substantial government-led stimulus, also supported by the private sector, and backed up by other measures that don't require financial input but can make it easier for businesses, entrepreneurs, co-ops and state enterprises to create jobs. And whereas we may be ranked highly as a good environment for multinationals, for foreign direct investment, I think certainly the indigenous sector, small enterprises, homegrown enterprises, would tell a very different story of the business environment in which they are trying to operate or indeed even survive. So this stimulus has to happen and be complemented by deficit reduction measures, But those measures have to be such that they don't deflate the domestic economy and drag out the slump that we know we have in consumer spending. So I think the government's stimulus package, as announced, can only be described as a drop in the ocean, and it has to be seen against a sustained attack on capital investment spending. And let me spell out what I mean by that. Let's just remind ourselves that in December 2011, the capital budget was cut by government by €755 million, that this December it will again be cut by approximately €560 million, and it will be cut again for 2014 by €120 million. So that's money gone for the foreseeable future from the very part of the budget that is designed to stimulate growth and labour force activity. And indeed, virtually every commentator, including our friends in the IMF, consistently recommend against capital cuts when you are in the midst of a recession. And whatever spin is given here or elsewhere, a stimulus package of €2.25 billion simply won't compensate for that attack on capital spending. Just to say something else about the stimulus package as suggested, it's reliant on a number of things. Firstly, the sale of state assets. Secondly, on the use of public-private partnerships. And indeed on funding from domestic banks. Indeed, the only concrete monies identified within the stimulus package come from the National Pension Reserve Fund, of which we've heard lots over the last number of years, and monies from the European Investment Bank. So this approach to creating a stimulus pot, if I can call it that, begs a number of questions. Question number one in my head is this: why is it that, given that the National Pension Reserve Fund in June held discretionary funding to the tune of €5.8 billion, why is the government not accessing more of that reserve, or indeed all of that reserve, for stimulus? I hope that they do not plan to use more of the pension reserve for bank recapitalisation. And I hope that because of the €20 billion from the fund that we've already pumped into the banks, that €20 billion now has an estimated value of €8 billion. So it's not a good return, it's not a good investment of that fund. That's question number one. Question number two is, why rely on the sale of state assets? Indeed, what's the rush to sell off the family silver? You see, selling profitable, self-financing energy assets, for instance, makes no sense. Over the last 10 years, the ESB and Bord Gáis have paid just shy of €2 billion in dividends to the state. And not alone that, they've delivered self-financed first world energy infrastructure right across the island. And I think the stimulus package, as announced by government, will only add to what you could call a fire sale environment emerging within its own asset disposal programme, and that's something that I oppose very, very vigorously. The third question is this: why hitch the wagon of their stimulus package to the public-private partnership approach? PPPs, as they're called, are at best a short-term gain with a long-term cost for citizens. These projects heap unnecessary debt on the exchequer and can cost multiples of the original capital investment. It has to be said also that in the current environment, they're a very volatile source of funding, and we saw that very clearly in the collapse of a number of social housing projects that were to be driven by PPPs in Dublin in recent times. The equivalent of public-private partnerships are called private finance initiatives in our neighbouring country in Britain, and there's increasing scrutiny and questioning around the use of that mechanism. Indeed, the Guardian newspaper recently reported that the British Treasury is looking at the whole concept of private finance initiatives because they are deeply concerned that they don't represent good value for money. So I'd ask those three concrete questions of the government, offering an inadequate stimulus package and shaping it in that way, I think sounds alarm bells. So you might reasonably ask, well, if that's not the way to do it, well, what is? So maybe I'll sketch out for you how I think we should approach this matter. I think, firstly, we shouldn't cut the capital budget over the next 4 years. And if we were to take the decision to sustain capital spending, that gives an additional 2.7 billion, if you like, in monies into the economy. Secondly, I think that we should use the remainder of the National Pension Reserve money into equity funding. And I think we should seek matching funding of a much more ambitious scale from the European Investment Bank. We're suggesting in the neighbourhood of 1.7 billion for the same period. I think we also need to incentivise finance, particularly from the Irish pensions industry. We met recently with representatives from that industry, and we were discussing with them a very particular idea around retrofitting and creating a green interest-bearing bank to fund a vast retrofitting programme across the state. And we'll set out the detail of that in September, as I said earlier. But I think suffice to say at this point that this industry is worth in the region of €80 billion. It's taking a battering abroad, and it is more than eager to look and find a stable environment for investment at home. And I think we should grasp that opportunity and not let the grass grow under our feet on it. And I think this eagerness is borne out by the announcement of the NTMA last week that it is going to issue bonds targeted at that Irish private pension industry. Now, I think this is the way that we should put together a stimulus package. I think, in our view, over the next 4 years, it should be of the minimum order of about €13 billion. And I think if we don't think in those ambitious terms, then we will simply be trying to put out a blazing inferno with a watering can. Stimulus can work. Stimulus can get people back to work. And I'm glad that the government belatedly accept this fact. It's a fact that's been established. If you look at the Construction Industry Federation, DKM, Economic Consultants, the ESRI, modelling predictions, all of those tell us that a capital investment of €1 billion will create 8,000 jobs in the short term and 4,000 long-term jobs. And these are the kind of figures that are used by the Department of Finance. And yet the government, when they announced their stimulus package of just over €2 billion, announced that they will create 13,000 jobs. I mean, for me, I struggle to find words to describe just how inadequate a response that is to the kind of unemployment crisis that we face in this state. We've 500,000 citizens on the live register. I'm sure we're all familiar with not just the hardship, but the kind of demoralisation that brings with it. And I think in light of that, a kind of half-hearted or gesture politics nod towards economic growth and economic stimulus is simply not sufficient and not good enough. In fairness, it's not just our government that has fallen short of the mark. The determination across the EU to save private banks, which they went at very wholeheartedly, and then in turn to impose austerity measures for deficit reduction, has dominated political and economic thinking over the last number of years. Laterally, and maybe most notably in the person of Mr. François Hollande, people have accepted the need for growth, but nothing like the same kind of attention or vigour or resources are being pumped into that policy approach. The banks were deemed too big to fail, but it seems domestic economies are not so. And with an average unemployment rate across Europe of over 10% and just staggering levels of youth unemployment in places like Spain and Greece, the potential for growth, our potential for growth, is consequently limited. We rely on exports, And we badly need our partner states, our partner economies, to start addressing the need for growth alongside any domestic plan that we would introduce. When they were in opposition, our friends in Fine Gael, and maybe most particularly in Labour, were very critical of the cutbacks imposed by the Fianna Fáil-led government, and they were absolutely right. And they adopted a language of fairness and of decency, and they articulated, at least at that time, an understanding that those who were struggling, the working poor, people out of work, had to be protected. That was then. But now in government, and it gives me no pleasure to say it, those same parties have gone with the austerity agenda with considerable gusto. They tell us that their plan to reduce the deficit is to dole out the tough medicine. And the thing about the tough medicine is this, you see, it's not so much around the citizen understandably asking the question, well, why should I pay €100 of a household tax to bail out bankers? Some citizens are asking that, but people are asking actually a more fundamental question than that. And people who are struggling to meet their household bills and just to get by, and all of you know this story, I'm sure, in your own maybe families and communities, ask the question as to why the person on a very modest income, living in a very modest home, pays the same charge as a millionaire living in considerable luxury. You see, that's not equitable, that's not progressive. And I think the level of protest against that particular charge had something to do with bailing out bankers, but it had something very significant to do also with an appetite amongst the general population to see tax equity, progression and fairness. And I think that those are things to be supported. We're all agreed on the need for deficit reduction. The question is, how do you do it? And the orthodox view of this government, just as the last, is that it's to cut services, to cut incomes, to introduce stealth taxes. That's their chosen path. Their difficulty is that their rhetoric of growth and job creation cannot and will not sit easily with that chosen path. And it's certainly rhetoric alone and small investments will not counter the damage done to the domestic economy by what is essentially a contractionary approach. Because every euro taken from the pocket of a low or middle income citizen is a euro taken from the local economy. And that pain is endured by families and communities, and the evidence of the failure of that policy is seen in the long dole queues, and it's seen while the shutters are drawn down on local shops and businesses the length and breadth of the country. Joe said when he was introducing this section that I think 40 people had left this village of the Glenties. I was talking to some local people, and they told me that in 1 week alone, in the neighbouring village of Frosses, 12 people left. 12 people left in 1 week. Now, suppose for people from cities, I'm a Dubliner myself, you might say, well, 12 doesn't sound so catastrophic. For small villages and for small rural communities, that is utterly, utterly catastrophic. And we've had, I suppose, the debate in this state dominated for understandable reasons around the banks and the failures in the banks and the culpability of the bankers. All of that is sound, but perhaps we missed the fact that the actual crisis in our society and the crisis in our economy is the crisis of joblessness, of unemployment, of hopelessness and of emigration. It's my firm belief that austerity will not cure the deficit. It's the wrong route to deficit reduction. Growth is the only game in town. The government so far, as I can see it, is sitting on the sidelines. It's time for them to pull on the green jersey and come out and play the game. Go raibh míle maith agah.